Evening, everyone, and welcome to Tortoise's Open News meeting on what you'd call a busy news day. And as ever, a nod to the mighty Mark St. Andrew for bringing a smile with It's My Party. Thank you very much for that choice, Mark. I suppose the question before us tonight is, what can a slow newsroom do in helping us to get closer to the truth of what's happening inside Boris Johnson's Downing Street and what happens next? And I say that because I've worked in fast newsrooms and I know what we'd be doing. We'd be trying to get someone on the record calling for the Prime Minister to resign. We'd be trying to see if we could sound out people off the record and figure out whether there are indeed 54 letters headed the way of the 1922 committee forcing a leadership challenge. We'd be trying to see what is shaping Sue Gray's report. But what does a slow newsroom do? And so we've been thinking about this, I suppose, in many ways all day, but actually in some ways for more than a year and a half, because if you've been following our reporting in the last week or so, you'll have seen that Lara Spirit has been trying to stand up a tip-off that we got over a year ago about the Prime Minister and his now wife's breach of lockdown at the very start of lockdown in March 2020. And it's taken a year and a half for Downing Street to nearly come clean on that. It still hasn't fully, but we've got a clear sense of exactly what happened. So I wanted to use this evening, if possible, to try and do a few things. One is, I'd like us just to unpick what we've learned in the Chequers case, because it feels to me as though it is symptomatic of three things: hypocrisy on the part of Mr. Johnson and Mrs. Johnson; two, an evasiveness and dishonesty on the part of the Downing Street operation; and three, a political attempt to move the goalposts from allegations of hypocrisy and a break of the public's trust to allegations of criminality. That is where the bar is being set for Sue Gray. So we'd like to understand what that Chequers process, that Chequers investigation tells us. I think we'll then look into, if we can, the Sue Gray report and the process of a challenge against Boris Johnson, where that leaves us today, after obviously the scenes in the House of Commons, but the scenes behind the scenes. And we're going to talk a little bit about who are the kingmakers in the Conservative Party. And then I'd like us to try and get to runners and riders, because everyone talks about Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak, but we know we'll probably get to more than that pretty quickly. So, as I say, our aim in a slow newsroom, and I've said before, is that we would like to figure out ways that taking a little longer gives people information, insights, or leads to investigations that they otherwise wouldn't have. And we hope that in this open news meeting, we might be able to do that. Fresh information, a different kind of insight, and if possible, investigations, either the explanation of the one we've done or ones that we should do from here. And so we're joined by a fair number of people inside our newsroom. Lara, as I mentioned, Matt Dancona, Kerry, a bunch of others. I hope that everyone will weigh in, but please do. Our newsroom is the best place, we hope, for people to bring their ideas, their observations, their queries about what's going on in the news. And so please do weigh in. We want to hear from you, and don't hold back. I'll bring you in as soon as is humanly possible. Lara, let's start with you though. Tell us just a little bit about the process so far on Chequers and what you think it says.
Hi. So where we are currently, or maybe better to talk about the process leading up to this, but as you have mentioned, this has been a really long-running investigation that started before my time here at Tortoise and has been going on for 18 months. And when I joined, you asked me to begin looking into this, and when I did, I mean, to me, having followed politics quite closely, I was surprised to find how little I knew about how Chequers was run, the access that the Prime Minister has to Chequers, how incredibly secretive and private the way that the House, which is, as we know, the Prime Minister's second home, is managed. And with an allegation like this, which is that the Prime Minister used his second home against lockdown rules, I thought it would actually be easier to stand up whether or not, at the time of announcing the national lockdown, something all of us remember very clearly, the Prime Minister had made use of this House against the rules or not. And actually it proved incredibly difficult. It was impossible to get hold of anybody in the Chequers Trust. It's impossible to even find out who's a member of it, beyond knowing a couple of the odd seats that sit on the board there. But looking into it a little bit more, I managed to track down via some public social profiles some people who had been involved in this case, and we managed to come a lot closer to an answer, which is that we're really, really confident that the Prime Minister did indeed move after making his speech on the 23rd, where he told 27 million people who watched that address that night, from tonight, I want to give the British people a very simple instructions that you must stay at home. We now believe that he drove that very same day. The second part of my work on this has been trying to work out where Mrs. Johnson, then Carrie Johnson, was during this period. And I've put the link in the chat to the report where it details the specifics of Mrs. Johnson's movements that we've now been able to ascertain. But essentially, she was moving back and forth between Downing Street and Chequers between the period of the 20th and the 28th of March. It's also come to light recently. I found out over the weekend that Chequers was closed on the 28th of March due to staffing considerations. Now, I found out that at least one member of the Chequers staff had tested positive. Obviously, you will remember that this was the weekend that the Prime Minister himself tested positive, and also that we later found out Mrs. Johnson had the virus also. So this period of movement at the beginning of lockdown was a period where both were likely to be infectious also. So staff at Chequers were put under risk. They were anxious and hesitant. Downing Street confirmed to us to go into the workplace. The House was closed on the 28th and Mrs. Johnson came back. Now, the kind of reason why this is an ongoing issue and the reason why it still matters, obviously it fits, I think, very appropriately within the kind of current political crisis and the accusations of lies that are engulfing Boris Johnson's administration, but also because it's an ongoing investigation, because Downing Street have been so evasive with me and with others who have dealt with them over this matter. So, I mean, when we first put this question before my time, as you'll remember, we were flat out told this movement didn't take place. We now know that's not true. And then what has become quite like a sort of bizarre semantic game between myself and various Downing Street press officers. We're trying to find a way to actually even discuss what lockdown was. I mean, it's getting so kind of ridiculous that a press officer on the phone to me yesterday got into this kind of odd discussion about whether the lockdown was introduced on the 23rd of March or not. Now, Downing Street are telling us now that it was introduced on the 26th at 1 p.m. That's not how it was understood to people who watched and to people who complied with these regulations from the night that Boris Johnson told us to all stay in our homes. So it falls into, like you said, this pattern of evasiveness, of dishonesty, not just of the Prime Minister, but also of the Downing Street press office, and an aim to kind of move the goalposts, as you said, to suggest that wrongdoing rests at criminality only, when actually there is this broader, huge corrosive impact, I think, that this will have on public trust around what the regulations were and when. And I think quite rightly, some people will be feeling like they've been taken to fool. So the kind of latest on this investigation is that as of tonight, we'll be publishing an open letter to Sue Gray in the hope that she will continue include this case in her in tray alongside the.
I'm just going to pause it 1 second, Laura, before we get to the Sue Gray thing. I just think I just want to do two things just with people. One is Andrew Girdwood had just made a point about just jargon and standing up. Sorry about that, Andrew. Is like so standing up is if you get if a source tells you something, obviously you can't publish anything when it's single sourced or only in the most exceptional circumstances. So what you try to do is then go out and find other sources that prove that's the case. One of the reasons why this story has been so difficult is that in the first instance, back in June 2020, we were expressly told that it was untrue. It's only a year or so later that actually Downing Street itself has confirmed that Johnson, to use their words, did, quote unquote, commute backwards and forwards between Chequers and London. And when we kept on pressing them, is that the case that he kept commuting, even after he'd issued the instruction on national television to 27 million people to stay at home, they've refused to confirm it, except to say that he was back in Downing Street by January the 26th, by March the 26th. And so what you then have to do is try and find other sources, right, that further corroborate the source, because what you've got is what's known in journalism as a non-denial denial, i.e. they don't answer the question, but they don't confirm it either. So we've gone to further people who've also corroborated this fact. And I think there are two things about it. One of them is very clear, which is you say one thing and then you do another, right? But I think there are quite a lot of people who go, well, look, it was quite difficult for them. You know, Carrie Johnson was pregnant, what difference does it make whether he's working from Chequers or he's working from London? The reason why I think that when we first got this tip off, and I'll come to Kerry Thomas in a second about this, but when we first were told about this in June 2020, when the kind of rules of that lockdown and the instruction of March 23rd was so fresh in our minds, why at the time Kerry and I remember talking, saying, if this is true, if he made that national address and, hours later was in a car, he's going to have to resign, was because it was completely at odds with what was being expected of people in terms of staying at home. Remember, this is pre-coffee on a bench with one other person. This is full lockdown. And I suppose that at the heart of this is a bit of a story that we're probably not explaining fully. And that is a very, very practical personal thing, which is, I remember when I started covering politics in the UK, and actually I didn't really get close to politics in the UK until after I'd come back from covering Washington, was being surprised how mean the British system is to the Prime Minister's family. By which I mean, if you become Prime Minister, you move into the flat above Downing Street. The deal there is there are cleaners, right? But they clean the fabric of the apartment. They're not on hand 24/7 to cook you food and do the dishes and do your laundry, right? But if you go to Chequers, they are. If you go to Chequers, you've got half a dozen people who cook your meals, who do the laundry, who do the washing up. And so the reason why the conversations between Lara and Downing Street feel so evasive is that what the Downing Street team and what Mrs. Johnson's team has done has prayed in aid her pregnancy and say the reason that she left Downing Street, where incidentally there's no one upstairs in the flat, to go to Chequers, where there are half a dozen members of staff, some of whom then got COVID, is because she was pregnant and in a vulnerable category. Initially, they said she was categorized as in a vulnerable category, then turned out they meant that by being pregnant, she was in a vulnerable category. She was in a vulnerable category and then wanted to make a greater effort to social distance. This doesn't make any sense because, of course, there are people in the house in Chequers where they're not in a Downing Street flat. There are people in the car that drives you to and from Chequers. And she had to then go back and have a scan, which then meant more contact with more people. And so the issue here is that the public argument for why they've done this is at odds with the private truth, which is she was pregnant, the Prime Minister was trying to deal with a pandemic, and they decided it's going to be easier to live in Chequers with the support that we've got there. And part of our issue here is, look, there is, of course, a higher bar for the Prime Minister. He's issuing the instructions, he's got to obey them. But even if he got to the point of saying, look, we took a decision, which was that given the extraordinary pressures on me and the fact that my girlfriend, now wife, was pregnant, we took the decision to actually base her in Chequers because we thought she'd be kind of better supported and I could get on with the job of trying to address the pandemic. They could front that up and be honest about that. But instead, what we've had is, as we say, an outright denial, which now proves to be untrue, a great deal of dissembling and evasiveness, and then a shifting of the goalposts, which is, oh, we thought you were asking whether or not they were breaking lockdown as set by the law, 1 p.m. the 26th of March 2020, versus what everybody else understood, which was an instruction from the Prime Minister on first the 16th of March, then on the 23rd of March, to stay at home starting that evening. And so I suppose that's the issue. And the reason we keep pressing this, and we're aware of the fact that most of the rest of the media still focuses exclusively on parties. But the reason we keep coming back to that is that it speaks to two things. One, the behavior of the Prime Minister and his wife, rather than just staffers, and two, the behaviour of Downing Street in being evasive and dishonest in addressing this when they could front up. So I hope that gives some explanation, Andrew. I know you're saying standing up. I was trying to give some context for it. Laura, I'm going to come back to you and Sue Gray in a moment, but I just wanted to bring Kerry in because he was involved in this back in, God, it feels like the before times, June 2020.
Yeah, hi, James. Hi.
Hey. I just wondered, I mean, because we've had a conversation also about what you think the issues are in this story, whether it's Johnson in the House, what he said, or what Downing Street said to you back in the summer of 2020. I mean, so how do you read it?
Yeah, I mean, I think you've given us a very good summary of the issues just now. For me, I suppose, when I look back to June 2020 now, I feel like I was playing a game by rules and I didn't know the rules on the other side had changed. I'm looking at the text I sent back then. So I texted the head of communications at Downing Street and said, we'd heard that the Prime Minister visited Chequers between, I gave him the 23rd to 27th of March, had the Prime Minister visited during those dates. 2 days later, he came back and said he didn't visit during the dates you mentioned. A day later, I went back to him and said, look, I'm just checking because we've got this from a good source. Are you sure? Let's not play with the language here. Was the Prime Minister there in any capacity during those dates? And I got the same answer. Same answer as before, I'm afraid. He was not there between those dates. We now know, as Laura said, for sure that he was. Now, actually, the interesting thing about talking to younger people at Tortoise about this is they're not surprised that I was straightforwardly lied to in that way. But I am surprised because having dealt with various Downing Street since probably the early 1990s, I definitely can't think of another instance when I have been straightforwardly lied to like that. And I think when I've talked to other people who've been closer to politics than I have, they would say the same thing, that there's an expectation that, you factor in a degree of prevarication or, slipping around. But the idea of just straightforwardly lying, that's a new thing. And so I think it points to a cultural change in Boris Johnson's Downing Street that actually, since we're all talking about culture in other ways, it seems to me to have happened quite early. I struggle to believe that I would have been lied to like that without that having been checked up the chain at Downing Street. And this is within 9 months of Boris Johnson becoming Prime Minister.
I think that's an interesting point, isn't it? Because there is a risk with this story. I mean, less so with parties, because parties, particularly on the eve of the funeral of the Duke of Edinburgh, people have very, very little sympathy for. But with this, people would say, look, as with, for example, the Sunday Telegraph story about Carrie Johnson hugging someone, is probably everyone's thought to themselves, oh God, I might have made a journey that I knew I shouldn't have done, or I might have hugged someone at a time when I knew I shouldn't have done. Some people have been like completely by the letter. Most people have tried to be overwhelmingly by the spirit. But it's the approach since then. And I suppose the interesting thing is, Kerry, I'm coming to Matt in a second on this. It's just, I'm interested to know, I thought, how much is this the personality of Boris Johnson then becoming the personality of the whole Downing Street operation? And whether or not you think that denial in June 2020 was in fact the way in which Boris Johnson handled kind of unwelcome questions.
I think that it's probably too easy, but it's tempting to retrofit all that. So I think you would say, from what we know of Boris Johnson and what we're now finding out about his Downing Street, that they share characteristics. That when you're in a corner, tell a whopping lie, and if you get found out, then deal with it later on. That's something that there's a pattern there that we can see in Boris Johnson that we're now seeing replicated in the way that people around him have behaved. And you don't have to just, Matt Dancona would speak to this better than me, but if you talk to people in Gordon Brown's Downing Street, that had a character. It's a very different character from Boris Johnson. But this is a place, not a huge place, a warren of connected offices and and a strange mix of home and work, as everybody says. But it's set up with that fundamental purpose, which is to serve the Prime Minister. And so it seems to be not at all surprising that it takes on elements of the character of that person. I am perhaps a little bit surprised that, given we're talking about, June 2020, that it took on this characteristic quite as quickly as that. You might have hoped and thought that the kind of inertia in the system, that the belief in doing things certain ways would have been in the water, and that it would have been less easily dispensed with. But it seems pretty clear that by June 2020 things were happening in very, very different ways than they had for ever before, in my experience.
Okay, well, I'm going to Kerry, thanks. Matt, I've got a whole bunch of questions, but tell us sort of where you're at tonight.
Well, I mean, to answer your initial question, James, which I think is the key, which is how do we do this in terms of slow news? I mean, the Chequers story is a fabulous example of taking our time. And I'm sort of minded to, get a T-shirt printed for Laura saying nevertheless she persisted, because I mean, speaking only for myself, I tried to land this story and I didn't. And I sensed, I mean, I think perhaps Kerry's had a better experience of Number 10 than I have. I mean, I sensed they were lying, but I couldn't land it, and Laura has, and that's a very good example of how you can use the format of a slow newsroom to keep going at something which in a fast newsroom, as we all know, would have just been left behind. I mean, the other thing you can do in a slow newsroom is look at things structurally. And I think that's why this is so interesting, which is what's going on in all this. Again, I mean, I think the commuting story hasn't cut through because the eyes of the media are still absolutely laser-like on the parties. I'm not sure I agree with the contention that people would be, if they started to think about the commuting, would be more liberal and more open-minded and more tolerant, for the simple reason that most people in this country don't have one house, let alone two. And also I remember how the Dominic Cummings story, which was essentially a commuting story, when it was the only story in town, cut through big time. And Deborah Mattinson's polls at the time, she's now Keir Starmer's chief pollster and strategist, went off the charts about this. People really didn't like it. I think if Johnson survives long enough for it to matter, this story will cut through. At the moment, it's so, it's competing with so many other things like David Davis, defections, Sue Gray, everything like that. But the bit of the story that it really connects to, like a mains chord, is the Red Wall. And the fact that what was really interesting today was Christian Wakefield crossing the House from Tory to Labour, the member for Bury South. And this is, I think, the sort of, for a slow news organisation, this is one of the hearts of the issue, which is you have a group of MPs who came into Parliament in traditionally Labour seats as Tories in 2019. They were part of what made the 2019 intake feel like the transformation of the Conservative Party to the Tory party. But they represent constituencies where this kind of behaviour, this kind of hypocrisy, this kind of elite behaviour goes down unbelievably badly. And what's interesting, and again, this is a sort of slow news perspective, is that the person who foresaw this or worried about it instantly was Boris Johnson. I dug out what he said on the morning of December the 13th, as his party was celebrating its 80-seat majority. You could see Boris Johnson, having an intimation of mortality. He said to the Red Wall voters, he said, you may have only lent us your vote. You may not see yourself as a natural Tory. And as I think I said 11 years ago to the people of London when I was elected in what I thought of as a Labour city, your hand may have quivered over the ballot paper before you put your cross in the Conservative box. And you may think you will return to Labour next time round. And if that is the case, I'm humbled that you've put your trust in me, that you've put your trust in us, the Tories, and we will never take your support for granted. Problem is, that's exactly what they did. And so if you're looking at this as in terms of social structure, that's one of the big problems. Subtext, also Scotland.
So Matt, I'm going to come back to you in a second. By the way, I thought it was very interesting today in the Commons in PMQs. I'm sure not everyone had the chance to watch it, but if you did, there were two things that really stood out to me. One was right towards the end of the questions with Starmer, Johnson tried to play the trust card. He tried to say thank you to people for having the trust to take up the vaccination, the booster program. And I thought, oh, that's the weakest card you've got right now is trust. But the other thing that was most interesting was that Starmer only asked him one real question, which was, do you think a prime minister who lies in parliament should resign? And that was the one question he didn't answer. And that seems to me to be to get us back. Actually, sorry, before I go just back to Laura, one other thing, Matt. There was a point made here by Greg Mulligan in the chat. I don't know whether you saw it, Matt, which was just about just on the sort of stories overall, not just Chequers, but parties overall. What's going on in the right-wing press? What's the deal if James Forsyth is married to Allegra Stratton? What's the deal if, James Slack is now the deputy editor of the Sun? How much do these things impact, do you think, on the sort of force of coverage that we've seen in the last 6 weeks around parties?
Oh, hugely. I mean, and in ways that that give real meaning to the phrase unconscious bias, because the intersplicing of the journalistic and political world, it's always happened to some extent. I mean, Ian MacLeod, famous Conservative MP, was also editor of The Spectator, and Nigel Lawson was editor of The Spectator, and so on. There's always been that sort of connection. But there's now a kind of revolving door relationship between the media and the political world. And the individuals, obviously, the connections between the individuals are fascinating. And in this instance, you can imagine a kind of wonderful organogram of how they're all connected, married, each other's, godparents to each other's children and so on. But it's obviously unhealthy. And it's also unhealthy, I think, in a different way, which is Johnson has tried to govern Britain by editing it. He's tried to impose a story about himself as he, and I was a successor at The Spectator, and he was very helpful to me. But he edited The Spectator by making The Spectator the Boris, and he's trying to govern Britain by making Britain Boris nation, Boris land, and it's not sustainable. A country is not the same as a chirpy centre-right weekly. They're not. They're quite different. One is a G7 nation, the other is a nice magazine. It's a very nice magazine, but it's quite a lot smaller than the UK. And I think that relationship between media and politics has been very clear in all this, and explains some of the opacities and evasions.
Let's come back to that, because I think that's going to have a big impact on, if you like, the sort of second half hour, which is runners and riders, the Tory game from here. But just before we do that, Connor, I don't know whether or not you can bring up the letter that Laura's written to Sue Gray, because I think it leads as kind of a meaningful way of thinking, okay, well, where have we got to on Chequers, but also then where does she get to in the process of investigating the Prime Minister? Are you able to bring up what that letter says? Thanks, Connor. So I'm absolutely useless at reading and talking at the same time, but some people are good at that. But Laura, given that this is the case you're putting to Sue Gray, do you want to just explain what the argument is, what the position is that we're putting to the government, the ask that we're making of her?
Sure, sorry, I was just on mute. So the big ask of Sue Gray is to try and include in the remit of her ongoing investigations about wrongdoing in Downing Street, this question of whether and how the PM travelled to Chequers on 23rd of March 2020. So the specific break of rule that when I've gone to Downing Street repeatedly to ask about the specific nature of this trip on this day. I've had, as you've said, a series of non-denials, and we've had, as you've mentioned, a series of discussions about at what point a non-denial becomes an admission. And in light of that, I think that Sue Gray should consider this as part of her investigation, because I don't think that I'm going to get anything else from Downing Street given my recent interactions from them. But I think it matters because I think it's part of, as you say, the pattern of evasiveness and dishonesty from Downing Street. It's part of a pattern of Boris Johnson telling the country to do one thing and himself, in this case, near immediately doing another. And it's also the Prime Minister, it's not staffers. It's a question of the person who leads this country and his behaviour at a time that, as people have pointed out in the chat, was a really terrifying and uncertain one. So I think when thinking about the levers that you have to find the truth on this, is very clearly a public interest to know exactly what the nature of these trips are. And I think while we know that we've had this admission of commuting, and we've been told that it doesn't break the law because we were told he was back by 1 p.m. on the 26th, I think quite a lot of people in this call would agree that there is very clearly a level of wrongdoing in using that house to commute, when the logical sense that we've been through doesn't really seem to make any kind of strong case for why that house was being used. So we're hoping that, or at least this is a kind of attempt to try and get this on the radar of Sue Gray when she's considering this investigation, because she may perhaps have more levers or more available to her by way of being able to gain clarity on these outstanding points than we've had so far.
And just to be clear, I mean, I'm going back to sort of Andrew in terms of the standing up of a story. The kinds of things that Sue Gray gets access to that, frankly, we would normally get access to, but aren't in this case, is that Thames Valley Police keep a log, because there are police officers who stand outside Chequers, of who comes in and who comes out. Now, there's no security reason why you can't know that now. This has happened nearly 2 years ago. Sue Gray could get that Thames Valley Police log. Sue Gray could get from Chequers what we have not been able to get from Chequers, which is an account of staffing over the course of that time. So she could very quickly get a very clear explanation of exactly what happened. And the reason, just to underline it, why we keep making this point about we're making an allegation of hypocrisy, not criminality, is that the very telling experience we had was that when asking about the Prime Minister and Mrs. Johnson's movements between the 16th of March and the end of the month, their answer was, oh, well, he didn't, your allegation that he breached lockdown is completely false. He was, lockdown started on the 1st of March, at 1 p.m. on the 26th of March, 2020.
Yeah.
Like, you've got to be kidding.
Yeah.
When did that happen? We all saw the announcement on the 23rd of March. We actually saw the comments he made on the 16th of March. So this is a complete rewriting of things. And I suppose the other point about criminality, which is important here, is that Allegra Stratton, Matt Hancock,
exactly,
the bar for them was never a criminal one, right?
No.
So I think all of these things have a bearing. All of which is to say, this might well be, entirely academic. And I saw that Patricia referred to the subject of her dissertation being the use of second homes. Patricia, we might come to that in a moment, but I just think we should get straight to the politics, because the reality is we might still be bleating away about the use of Chequers, and before we know that, before letters into the 1922 committee, and a process has begun. So Matt, sorry, just to play back to you, can you just talk through, I know we don't know how many letters are in, right? And what I am interested to know, which I think we do know a little about, is who are the kingmakers now? Who do we watch?
Well, the people to watch always in any conservative leadership contest. We're assuming, let's assume for the moment that Johnson has gone, which is a big if, but I think the Sky have counted 12 definites. And what was in, just to linger on that question for a moment, it was very interesting and notable that Johnson twice referred to Sue Gray's report coming out, quotes, next week, which was clearly designed to make MPs hold off their letters and say, wait until it's not long to go, guys. Wait until the report comes out, then we'll see. But if we're looking at a sort of post-Johnson situation where you are actually asking who are the kingmakers, then it's a combination of, it's several kinds of people. I mean, first of all, there are the people like Dominic Cummings who now sit atop what can only be described as sort of network politics. They have an extraordinary reach. They also have an extraordinary data bank of information on everyone. So I think Cummings will be important whatever happens. Then you also have a sort of class of people like Michael Spencer, another person who's come out, a former Tory treasurer who's already coming out against Johnson, who have given lots of money to the party, would be imagined as future donors, will give money to campaigns, and will play a significant role in shaping the debate. And they often these characters audition prospective candidates. I mean, actually audition prospective candidates. Dire and horrible occasions. I've been to one or two. And then I suppose a third category is Tory MPs who own, or Tory lords who own big houses. So it used to be Jonathan Aitken in Lord North Street, and we now gather that Gavin Williamson, who of course was finally sacked by Boris Johnson, has moved into a large house in Westminster. What could this mean? So that's very interesting. And a final category, which I suppose I ought to have mentioned in the network politics ledger, was people buying up web domains. And I was reading a report that a whole bunch of Liz Truss web domains have been bought up in the last 36 hours. Now, that could be another campaign trying to buy them so that she can't. But it's also more likely that it's someone working on her behalf buying these campaign domains so they can be used if and when the pistol is shot.
And Matt, while we're at it, then let's just have a look at then let's go at runners and riders.
Well, I mean, everyone talks about Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss, and there'll be lots of, oh, there they are. Okay, so there's Rishi, there he is. The pound shop Portillo, as he was described to me by a cabinet minister this week. I mean, he's the front runner. I think it's a ridiculous idea because of his essentially 1,000-year-old ideas. I mean, he's a Thatcherite who happens to look like modern Britain. Pass. But people may disagree. I can't imagine Rishi Sunak building up an electoral coalition that works. Penny Mordaunt has been lurking around. She wrote a book recently and was promoting it like Topsy amongst columnists, and has softened her image somewhat since the Leave referendum. I remember she was described when we were in East Castle Street by one member as a woke Brexiteer, which is a interesting and telling label. Liz Truss is interesting because everyone has different opinions about her. I mean, in a sense, the thing about Liz Truss is there's not much to say about her because there's not a huge amount there. But what she does do is a series of tribute acts. I mean, she can do a little bit of Boris in a kind of, I understand how ordinary people think. She's a Remainer who became a Brexiteer, so we know she'll say anything to win. And she's also got very strong Thatch vibes. Her Christmas card, as you'll recall, was basically an image of her as a sort of failed auditioner for the Crown, surrounded by regalia and flags and very grand. And Nadine Zahawi, he'll be the competence candidate. He'll be the vaccination candidate. I got Britain jabbed. I can get the job done. Although I think Sajid Javid, who was very energetically briefing on the rollback of COVID restrictions today, just about an hour ago, will also be running on the competence ticket, and Jeremy Hunt likewise, and will argue that he's uncontaminated by the Johnson years and therefore has a stand-in. But there'll also be other people we haven't considered, like Tom Tugendhat. He seems to have a sort of head of steam who'll certainly want to put a marker down. Other people quite fancy Tobias Ellwood. I mean, the problem is you get into almost when there's no standout candidate, you get to the point where Larry the cat is in contention, and very good he'd be too. But you know, be in no doubt, Nadine Dorries is thinking now, how can I become Prime Minister, because I should be.
And Matt, just what does this? I want to come to Emily in a moment about where Labour, what this is telling us about Labour, and I don't know whether or not Sudi or Darius or Nico, who've all put comments in the chat, want to weigh in. If so, just please sort of raise your digital hands. But I just want to get a sense of one thing, Matt, which is, you know, I started out my first sort of time reporting actually in Westminster was in, I think, what it must have been sort of 95 or so, 96. This is kind of latter day major, a tired Conservative government. This kind of thing was happening a lot. Right, there were a lot of people who really didn't like each other, and the party was falling apart. And I just, before I get to kind of Emily on, okay, what's the opportunity for Labour, what's needed from Starmer, just boringly in policy terms, what does it mean for everything from energy bills to levelling up to any kind of meaningful and fundamental agenda on policy?
Oh, it's very important what it means for policy. I mean, it's not boring at all, because the trouble is that the gravitational pull in a post-Boris leadership contest will be to revert to a small state, deregulation, anti-green, low spending answer. But the sector, the quadrant of politics where elections are won now is not there. It's for politics that looks at, you know, questions like the cost of living, not just in terms of market solutions, but also in terms of how government interacts smartly with those problems, green issues, longevity issues, digital regulation. The list goes on. What you can't do is result in terms of policy making is pretend that it's the 1980s, any more than Thatcher could have come in 1979 and thought, I wonder what Neville Chamberlain would have done. But be in no doubt that if he goes, there will be huge numbers of people in the Tory party, parliamentary party as much as outside, who say, right, at last we can get rid of all this reckless spending, infrastructure talk, greenery, you know, anti-liberty discussion, and go back to what Lord Frost would call real conservatives and real conservative values. That will dominate the agenda.
I mean, it's really striking how much that politics now leads policy and Operation Red Meat, etc. I just want to respond to one point by Mehdi in the chat, which is, you know, why is he putting so much faith in Sue Gray? Mehdi, what I heard, at least, or what we heard this week, was that there was a sense that Sue Gray might end up being quite helpful. You know, there was the briefing right at the beginning of the week that was around the fact that she wasn't going to find an example of criminality. In the last 24 hours, the version of things is that it's got more difficult for Johnson because of WhatsApp messages. And I think one of the reasons why Starmer was pressing the point about when was he told about the party is because they think that he lied last week in saying he had no idea that it was a party, it was a work event, because they think that the WhatsApp messages show that he was informed in advance. So I think that the sense of things getting more difficult for him around the Sue Gray report is at least the story that's doing the round. Who knows? We will find out when she reports. But Emily Benn, I'm going to come to you, Nico, in a moment. But Emily Benn, can I just come to you? I was really struck, by the way, Emily, that we're getting a much jauntier version of Keir Starmer.
Yeah.
You know, didn't you notice?
He made jokes at the dispatch box, which is, you know, that's the good politician coming out of him, not just the good lawyer.
Yeah. So what do you think then? What happens? Well, firstly, can I just ask you something about Bury South? Do you think that an MP crossing the aisle has the effect of galvanizing Labour, but weirdly closing ranks among Tory MPs? That's
what it did pre-PMQs. Actually, it gave the Conservatives something to rally around a bit, at least their MPs on the benches, because, you know, you suddenly have this common enemy that's done almost the unthinkable and crossed the tide. So in some ways that may have helped Tory MPs. In the Labour Party, the ones that the one section of the Labour Party that really can't cope with this news has been the kind of far left Corbynite. Young Labour put out a statement saying, how dare he come, he's got nothing to do with the Labour Party, perhaps forgetting, of course, that you do have to persuade former Conservatives to ever going to win a general election, if not Tory MPs and at least Tory voters. So it has annoyed some of the very left of the Labour Party, but that's just part of that stuff in the Labour Party of who controls the NEC. It's now Starmer and his team, and they're doing reselections. Labour MPs are all in the process of reselections as we speak. So that's all part of that. But I don't know if there are any more. I mean, it's very easy to brief that there are, as Labour sources have been doing to journalists all day today. I don't know. The leader, the CLP secretary of Bury South has welcomed him with open arms. I can imagine there are some people who want to be the Labour MP for Bury South being a bit annoyed that this guy is now, at least for now, taking his seat. But it's for once, being the leader of the opposition in the last couple of weeks has not been the worst job in politics. Actually, Keir Starmer is able to enjoy it because there has been enough ammunition, and for someone that people were concerned that he would miss political open goals, I don't think he's missed many open goals at all in the last couple of weeks. And the one thing I would say is the Labour Party needs money. It is suffering financially. This is often talked about in conversation like this, but it does make a difference if you're thinking about campaigning in general elections. It spent, £2+ million fighting legal cases. It has less money coming from unions, and is probably on the cusp, and is trying to be on the cusp of replacing that money from somewhere else. But that stuff does matter.
Emily, thank you. I'm going to go to Nico, then I'm going to come to Sam Houston in a minute, and then to Claudia, because she, I think, asks a question that I might ask you to answer. Nico.
Well, I think there are broadly two conclusions that we can come to from Partygate and Lara's investigation and the kind of general apparent hypocrisy which we've seen from Neil Ferguson through to Cummings and Hancock and so on. And one is either that government is not fit to govern and to lock us down because it's hypocritical, and you can't, certainly in Britain, be a hypocritical authoritarians, or you might conclude that they wanted to prolong the pandemic measures because they were lining their pockets and so on. Not a view I go with particularly. Or you might go with a view that they were inducing fear in the population, manipulating the science, policy-led evidence, as we call it, and generally acting in bad faith for reasons that we could go into, and that as such we shouldn't have gone along with the measures they put in place. We shouldn't have taken them seriously, and we should have been given the degree of freedom that they granted themselves to decide for ourselves about what was appropriate. And for the next year or more, there will be stories coming out, which the BBC are now publishing, Jeremy Vine and others. Everybody is going to be telling the stories about the awful things that happened during lockdown. Now, you can, of course, justify those things, but I think, like the Iraq War, the stories that will come out will be put into complete proportion, or the benefits of lockdown, if there were benefits, which I'm sure there were. And that's not the conclusion which people in the media, and to be honest, in this discussion, we've been coming to, that these measures were not only unscientific, badly thought out and inappropriate, and not proportionate to the impact that they'd have on the economy, on healthcare, on children's education, on social life. And I think we in the media need to be looking at that side of the question.
Yeah, I think
you could say Starmer should have been in power because he's a more controlled authoritarian. Now, I don't think that's the case. I think we should have been trusted by government in the way they trusted themselves to make decisions about what was safe for them, for people they cared for, and for the wider population.
And strangely, I think that this is obviously the play they're going to go for now, which is, okay, you in your little Westminster media bubble, you can fret about parties and checkers. In the big picture, have we made the right difficult call most recently over Omicron and COVID restrictions? Did we get the Brexit decision delivered? oddly enough, that will be, I think, the position. And I see that, Simon House of Green has been saying, will Boris Johnson actually quit because he wants to quit? He wants to get out of there. I thought one of the other really interesting things at PMQs today, I don't know whether you spotted, Nico, was like him saying about Bury South, we won Bury South under this Prime Minister, i.e. me, and we'll win it at the next election under this Prime Minister, i.e. come what may with Sue Gray, I'm planning to stay. So for all the talk about we'll wait for the report, he's made his mind up about what he's going to try to do. But Nico, I think you're right about that. I think you're right about the sort of COVID debate. I'm going to push on just because there are a few other people. Forgive me. I want to see if I can bring in Sam Houston. I think you're not on the road. I think you're at home. So I'm just interested to hear what you think.
Hi, yeah, I'm at home. Yeah, I'm not here to defend this government, but I am heartily sick of being told what should happen by Dominic Cummings. Dom did the Brexit. Dom broke the stalemate in Parliament. Dom got this Prime Minister elected, and now Dom decides when we don't want this Prime Minister anymore. He's still a democratically elected Prime Minister. I personally have thought for a while that Labour have a good chance of winning the next general election, but I just really am tired of. Dom knew all this stuff ages ago, but it's so clearly an orchestrated campaign. I just the kind of contrarian in me just doesn't quite think it's enough at this time. And I know that under the older political norms that we were talking about earlier, it should be more than enough. I just think under the terms under which Boris Johnson was elected, that perhaps this is, kind of some sympathy with what Helen says, that, that this perhaps should not be the issue to get rid of Johnson.
Except for the fact, isn't it the case, I mean, I don't know what you think on this, Sam, but isn't it the case that the extraordinary thing about Johnson has been his likability, and that's enabled him to reach voters that the Conservative Party was never able to reach before? And hasn't this done for his likability?
No, I don't think it will have done for his likability, because I think political timescales are shorter now, and all politicians have an expiry date, and especially prime ministers. I think that the reason that he might lose if he gets to 2024 is because he will just have kind of faded a little bit, and it'll be time for the new thing. Perhaps we talked about the pendulum before, but no, I don't think his essential likability. Inevitably he'll lose some people, and they would have had to have done incredibly well to hold on to those northern seats anyway. But I just don't think, for the people that voted for him, a lot of them, I don't think this is the issue that killed him.
Right. Okay. Claudia, can I come back to the question you asked, which is the Sue Gray report and process?
Yes. So I'm really interested in it because I think it matters. I think it'll matter to a lot of people to what extent the evidence that she comes across is then made publicly available. I think there's I think in the chat it was being said that it would be a summary report, so the conclusions would be made public and the kind of points that had been found. So, these rules were broken in this way. But, the WhatsApps, does she go to Chequers, and, what evidence has been looked at in what capacity and how those conclusions were made, I would find personally very interesting as a journalist. I'm sure most people would. But I also think it's going to really matter in terms of public trust in that report, because rightly or wrongly, there is a huge amount of kind of skepticism about what she is doing. And I think if people are just given a kind of, if the summary conclusion is actually, I think on the balance of probability, these rules weren't broken, I think there'll be people that won't believe that. Well, I think either way, actually, there'll be people who disagree with it.
I mean, one of the things, actually, Claudia, it might be something just to pick up with Giles, which is that there are two elements to this, because I can't get a straight answer to the question of what the process is, right?
Yeah.
Actually, to be honest with you, I can't get a straight answer to the question of what the question is, right? Is the question, did he say one thing and do another? Is the question, did he breach guidance? Did he breach rules? Or is it, did he breach the law, right? And they all see, so I don't know what the question is, but the process bit that I can't seem to get at is, can a civil servant who works for the government and is therefore answerable to the Prime Minister of the day question the Prime Minister? And is that person questioning the Prime Minister like, hey, what happened? Or is it under oath? I mean, what's the authority of that process?
Yeah.
And then and then we've got a whole other set of questions, which is, what are the answers? What does she publish?
And I mean, do you know, this is just maybe my own ignorance, but is the past precedent for that kind of report into the behaviour of the
Well, you see, the thing
Prime
they're doing
Minister?
is that what they're doing is that they are claiming that the Damien Green report, because Sue Gray did that, is the example. But of course, it's completely different, because then you're investigating on behalf of the Prime Minister
Yeah.
ministerial misconduct. The Prime Minister is not the person you're investigating. So I don't know. I don't know what will happen on that front. I saw, by the way, Simon House and Green asked the question about Michael Gove. I suspect if you ask Michael Gove, he'll say he's not running. But that's, I think that's the reason why we put him there as a kingmaker. Okay, Claudia, thank you very much. I'm just going to go for a final thought to Liz, if I might. Liz, what's your read on this, chiefly in terms of, if he stays, what happens, do you think, to trust, politics, the relationship between public and the government?
I heard, I didn't hear, I read, it's in a WhatsApp group that I'm in this morning, of somebody who had delivered a long planned training course for some very senior people, ex-military and now very senior people in the civil service. It was a sort of, leadership training course, you can imagine, the kind of thing. And the person who delivered that training had said that he had never experienced a day like it, because these very serious and sober people were crying about such was their upset and distress at what was happening to in the current administration. In answer to your question, and I think people in the chat have touched on it, I think there are people who feel themselves to be, whether they are ordinary voters like me or important people in the civil service, whoever you are, but if you feel yourself to be politically involved, engaged, or whatever the verb is, who will be will feel desperate, properly desperate. But I think that there are more people who have come through that and are already shrugging their shoulders and thinking, it's so terrible, you couldn't make it up. And I think that the route back to building trust is not clear for a successor to Boris Johnson, if and when that person arrives, on the side of the Conservative Party or on the or in opposition. If I think that it is not clear to me how somebody would be able to build sufficient consensus around the idea of trust of the person running the government, even that idea is even still a sort of valid and feasible idea. I don't think, I'm not sure.
I'm not sure either. I'm not going to try and wrap up with a kind of easy prediction on what happens with Boris Johnson, the 1922 committee, the runners and riders. I suspect all of us have views on that. I do think, just in the spirit of slow, that there are, though, kind of 4 things for us that are just worth watching out for. One is, I think there is a broad idea about what's happening to the institutions of Britain. And as we think about, and in 2022, one of the things we're thinking about is how do we report on and understand the efforts at remaking Britain, what's happening to institutions, whether it's packing the House of Lords, trust in Downing Street, the future of the BBC, all of these questions seem to be alive and made more pressing by what's happening in our politics. I think there is a second point. I try to make the point in the editor's voicemail, which is whatever happens day to day in Westminster, what's happening in the country makes life much, much more difficult for anyone in this government. You know, growth is yo-yoing around, but the long-term trend rate of it is low. Inflation, the cost of living, is soaring at levels we haven't seen for 30 years, and that's before the energy bills land in April. I think there is a real souring of relations between officialdom and politicians. They all feel played. Sue Gray is in the crosshairs now, but you know, I think if you kept a regular check of Christopher Geit, Lord Geit's temperature, you'd find that here was an example of someone who once believed in the establishment and now feels deeply embarrassed by it. And I think the old politics of the right that might have been able to play an argument, for example, around migration into this, now find that actually the UK is squarely reliant on what's been a shrunken population of people who come from other countries. And so the politics that were once available aren't. All of which means that what we're about to see, this attempt to try and shore up support on the right with policies that speak to them, you know, Nadine Dorris's position on the BBC was probably the one that she held already. It was just pulled forward to try and address the politics of the moment. But whether it's that or a host of other things, I think that the real Conservative problem is how do you drive the country forward, given the scale of the problems that you've got, not least the financial constraints you've now got with inflation, debt, energy bills. So I think the big picture strains are probably as acute as the short-term ones. Into that mix, I suppose we still stick with understanding the issue of trust, and that's why I hope you'll take a look in detail at the letter that Lara's written on Chequers. I think it's important in terms of a slow newsroom pursuing in a dogged and consistent way an investigation that seems to speak to the character of the Prime Minister and his operation in Downing Street. So do take a look at it, and we'll keep you posted as we move along. Thanks as ever for joining us for our open news meeting. Tomorrow night, by the way, on that very subject of how politics drives policy, we're going to be asking the question, would Channel 4 be better off in private ownership? Some people may think that's a good idea. Some people may think that's a bad idea. Tortoise is a place for civilized disagreement. Come and hope you'll join me in trying to come to a clearer understanding of what to think on that issue. We're joined by John Whittingdale, former Conservative Minister on Broadcasting, Michael Grade, now in the House of Lords, but seems to have run everything, the BBC, ITV, Channel 4 in the day. So there'll be plenty of people with plenty to say, and I hope we'll learn a good deal. Join us then. Thanks for joining us tonight.